What's up, you guys? So what we're going to do here is we're going to do the usual ToDo App, but I promise this will be worth your while. What we'll leverage in this technology is we're going to be doing NextJS14. We'll tie it in with Firebase. Specifically, we'll leverage the Firebase Authentication, Firebase hosting, and definitely the database, and we'll use Firestore for that. A couple things, we will slowly build this out. We'll start by creating a UI and making sure our app is working locally. And once we get that done, what we'll do is we'll progress it into implementing Firebase with authentication. And then once authentication is working, we'll then implement the database itself. The one thing that is powerful about Firebase is that you can get everything done on the client side. You can do your update, you can do your adding, you can do all those things, deleting of data from the database by just running it on the client side. So we'll start with the client side, but there are many of us that we prefer using the server side when it comes to those kinds of actions. So what we'll do is we'll make it happen first on the client side, and then we'll transition all of that code onto the server side, which Next.js does a really good job providing. We'll talk about different features, but again, we'll start locally first, building the app, and then we'll go from there. And hopefully you do end up finding this worthwhile. So let's get coding. All right, so the first thing that we'll do is let's set up our app by going, I'm already in my directory here to get started. So I'm gonna go ahead and run npm create next app at latest. So we're leveraging it, and we'll call this ToDo Firebase. So let it run. We're gonna use TypeScript, we'll use ESLint, definitely Tailwind, not the source directory, app router, because we want to make sure we showcase that, not in the import alias, and let it run. All right, so we need to go to the actual folder to make it run. So we're going to go to CD, okay, and then we're going to install all of the dependencies for it. All right, so now that all of our dependencies are installed, we're actually going to install one more thing because we're going to see this later, so might as well pre-install it. npm install Firebase, let's do that. We won't see this until a little bit later, but might as well have it done now. All right, so now that we have all the dependencies for Next.js installed, we have Firebase installed, let's go ahead and start putting together our UI. So I'm gonna go ahead and run npm run div so we can look at it. All right, as you can see, our app is running. Let's do a couple things. Let's go ahead. I do have pre-written code that I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste so that we're saving some time here. So the first thing, let's go ahead and modify the home page. There it is. I don't think I need this to be that big, so let's go ahead and lower it down. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this, which also means I'm going to get rid of this. All right, so we are going to go ahead and paste this in there. And we're also going to use next navigation. Let's go ahead and add that on. And let's click save, see the update. There it is. I'm also going to get rid of our global CSS for now. Let's do that. So keep it simple. There it is. We have a get started. All right, so if you notice that the next link has it set up so that it is routed to a route ToDo/ToDo-app. We don't have that right now. If we try to click this button, let's see, we're going to run into an issue because that page currently doesn't exist. So that's going to be the next thing that we'll configure. So let's get going. All right, so to create that route, all we have to do, and again, this is different from pages. We're now using app router, and the convention is you create a folder and you name the folder the route you want it to be. So we're going to do this ToDo App, and then there are two ways to do this, but I'm just going to show you how this works first. We're going to use a page.tsx. What ends up happening is if you use page.tsx, it is the default component that will be rendered. So let's go ahead and code go in here. And we're going to call this ToDo App component. I'm going to go ahead and click save. So that is it. We've just created a route that will now render based on the click for getting started. So let's go ahead and do that. As you can see, it's now rendering the app component that we want to render when we go to the route. all right, to-do app route. But what we want is we want to be able to check whether a user is authenticated or not. There are many ways to do this. You could, of course, conditionally render things within this component, but Next.js actually has a really neat component called layout component, which is like a parent component that supersedes the page.tsx that we can leverage. So let's go ahead and showcase that so you understand what I'm talking about. If I click on create a new file, layout.tsx. Okay, so we're going to call this to-do app layout component. Okay, let's go ahead and save it. Well, you'll see, so right now this is currently rendering the to-do app component. If I save this, what you will see, I'll give it a second to pull that information. Now you'll see that it is now rendering the to-do app layout component, right? So now what we can do is we can do our conditional rendering based on whether a user is authenticated or not. So let's go ahead and manually do that. It is authenticated. Let's just say false. Okay, we're gonna make this into a one line. All right, and we're gonna say if they're authenticated, if this authenticated, we're going to render that component. If they're not, then let's render sign in for now, since we don't have a component for signing in yet. So let's go ahead and save that. They're not authenticated. It should say sign in. As you can see right here, they have to sign in because they're not authenticated. If they are authenticated, let's put true, it should render the other component, which is our pages.tsx, which is, oh, actually, I'm sorry, it's rendering our current layout component. What we want to actually render is this page.tsx, which is the app itself. So layout component takes in children, which by default page.tsx is the child. So if we go children, let's make sure we don't get yelled at by TypeScript here. Okay, and if we get rid of this and say children, okay, so right now it's rendering layout component, but if we go ahead and save that, what you'll notice is that it will now render our to-do app component. So what we have so far is actually pretty good. We have something that renders one or the other based on whether a user is authenticated or not. The next step that we're going to do is we're going to create our sign-in component, make sure we're taking in email address and password and being able to log in or sign up. So that'll be our next step. All right, so we're going to add in our sign-in component. There are two approaches to this. One is, I think, the more flexible way where you create a component for sign-in that can be used everywhere else. But if your app is only going to be rendering one page, then there's something called parallel routes. I'll show you that here in just a second. But for now, why don't we create our sign-in component. Let's go here. Okay, and while we're at it, let's go ahead and put in our code. Okay, so now that we have our sign-in component created, let's go ahead and import that. There, and then now what we can do is we can just use that. Oops. All right, so I have the sign-in component. All right, so now it is no longer mad at me because I put use client for my sign-in component. Since we are using use state, there are other ways around this, but for now, this is what we're gonna do. And then, as you can see here, right now we have this to true, but if we say false, it should now render our sign-in component. All right, so that works. That's pretty cool. All right, so the thing is, another way to do this, like I said, is that if you have only one place to sign in and there's only one page to render, like only the ToDo App page, then the other way that you can do is something called parallel routing. So the way it works is in the same route ToDo App, what you can do is you can create a folder. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a folder here. And the naming convention starts with an @ and then whatever the name of the route is, right? So I'm going to just call it sign in, right? So in here, you're going to create a file called page.tsx. And from there, all we'll do is let's just go ahead and copy all of the code from sign in. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then in layout, what you can do is, so instead of this sign in component that I have here, like I said, when you use the layout component, it acts as a parent. So there are other children. So the parallel route child that you created is called sign in. And over here, we're going to do the same thing. Let's just copy this. And we'll call this sign in. Just to make this look a little cleaner, let's put that in another line. Okay, so now I have the sign in parallel route, and what I can do is put sign in instead, just so, and then I no longer need this imported sign in. But if I press save, so as you can see, now the same sign in component is rendered, but now as a child component from parallel routing and not as the other component. But for this case, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and keep the other component, because what if this app grows and there are other features that it's going to have and we need to reuse this same sign in component? We don't want to keep moving components around. All right, so it should still render the same thing. We're good to go. All right, so we have our landing page. We have a route that gets us to the ToDo App that determines whether you're logged in or not. If you're logged in, it gets you into the app, which is the child. We have our sign in component that handles if they're not signed in. So let's go ahead and make this so that it says we are authenticated. And with this, I think what we need to do before we start tying into Firebase Authentication, and let's set up our UI for adding a ToDo component. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that quick. Over here, what we're going to do is we're going to have another folder, components that has to do with the ToDo App. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create a file, tsx. Add ToDo component. Then what we're going to do is we're going to return a form. Okay, so now our ToDo component is ready to go. Let's go ahead and import that. All right, so we have an add to do. I mean, we could do something with this UI, but we'll just leave it at that for now. We need to put a handler on this, right? So what we want to do, what I did is we have our UI, we have our input, we have our button. We need to make sure that it is type submit. Okay, and then the other thing that we're missing right now, on submit handler, which is the handle submit. Oops. Clean that up a little bit. All right, so we have everything wired up, it seems like. So if I were to type in here, world, good. So it looks good. We have it consoling over here, which means our form is working. And our next step is we need to create our component that will render our to-dos as we add them, right? So first what we'll need to do is const to-do set to-dos. And then we'll just say any like this. Okay, so we'll leave it at that for now. So as we add a to-do, we want to add it in our to-do state. And then for now at least, we will pass it on to another component that will list it right at the bottom, right? So that's our goal here. So let's do that. So every time a to-do is being created, let's create an object. To-do is going to be to-do. Timestamp, we can just put a timestamp in here. Oops. And then we'll initialize that to not being completed. The form should be ready to go because we now have set to do when a to do is added. We also have it reset so we can continue adding on as we go through. The input is required so we're not accidentally adding empty strings into our to-dos. So let's go ahead and try this. Grocery, good. So you can see down here it's getting added. Workout, there it is. It's working. Awesome. So let's go ahead and add that on into our UI so we can see it. All right, so let's map it. What we want is, for now, we'll use index as our key, which is absolutely terrible practice, so please don't do that in production. Let's put a key, again, index. That's not something you want to do. What we'll end up doing is we'll use the ID of the to-do from the database as key later on. But for now, let's go ahead and render. As you can see, grocery workout is now rendering for us. That's great. Pick up food, feed dog, go for a walk. Everything is working. That's awesome. So we'll keep it simple. Go ahead and get rid of this console because we know that it's working. And it looks like we are set to go. So what we're going to do now is we need to set up authentication with Firebase. So this is going to be the next big step, which will take a little bit of time. But as soon as we get that going, we'll get authentication going, we'll get Firestore going, and then we'll be good to go. All right, so now that we have the form set up, we want to be able to, let's do this quick here. We want to be able to do authentication, so we legitimately send our user to the app itself when they are logged in, and then they have to log in or sign up if they are not, right? So what we're gonna do is let's go ahead and set up our Firebase app. So I'm gonna go ahead and open that up here. So let's do this. Open up a new tab, firebase.com. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and go to console here. And from here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna create a new app. So I'm gonna add a new project. And we'll call this one To-Do Firebase. Okay, I'm just gonna leave all the defaults in there. And then you'll have to pick your account for it. And let's let that set up. All right, so now that it's set up, let's go ahead and go to the actual project itself. Okay, now that we're here, there are a few things that we're gonna set up. First, let's do the authentication. Let's get that out of the way. Gonna get started. And for this one, we're just going to do email and password. There's certainly other easy implementations like Google Sign-In, Facebook, and so on. But for this one, we're just going to do email and password, all right? We're gonna enable it. If you wanted to leverage, this is actually a really awesome feature, which is the passwordless sign-in where it sends an email link. We won't do that for this project, but that's definitely a feature that's available if you do end up doing email and password. Cool. So now we're set up for authentication. Let's go and set up Firebase or Firestore. Let's create a database. That's good. We're just going to leave pretty much everything in default once it's initialized. The one thing is you do have to pick your regions. We're in the US, so we're just going to leave that alone. And I'm gonna start it on test mode. That means everything is accessible within your database. Later on, what you'll end up wanting to do when you are done with your development mode and you're ready for production mode, you need to add all your Firestore rules and whatnot. There's certainly a lot of documentation on that. All right, let's go ahead and create it. All right, so we now have an empty database that's ready to go. So we'll leave that for now. The next step and the final step that we need to do, let's go back to the project overview, is that we need to actually connect on an app for it so that we can actually initialize it in our website, in our app. So let's go ahead and we're gonna do web, we're not doing mobile here, so we're gonna do web. Let's click that. We're gonna call it ToDo Firebase. And we can say set up Firebase hosting. Maybe if we have time in this video, we'll launch it and we can use it. So let's go ahead and register the app. Okay, so now here are the crucial steps that we're going to need to do in order to make sure that everything is set up. As you can see, it exposes all the information about your application. It's got your API key, the domain, the project name. These are all essential to initializing the Firebase app when you set it up on your website or your web application. I know a lot of people freak out about the API key. I used to, but once you get the hang of setting up the rules in your database, the rules for authentication, the rules for cloud functions, if you ever use cloud functions, then having the API key exposed, which is not best practice to begin with, isn't really an issue as long as the whole security aspect of it is set up properly. For this tutorial, we're going to leave it exposed. A lot of times people put it in the .env file, which is best practice in many ways, but in this case, we're just going to leave it exposed. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is let's go ahead and follow this. At the beginning of this tutorial, we had already installed Firebase. Let's check. Cool. So we do have Firebase installed. If I look at package.json, we have a dependency for Firebase, so we should be good to go. Okay, so what we'll do is we are going to create a folder, and then we're going to create another folder for Firebase. And then we're going to create a file in there called client app.ts. I'm actually going to keep it JS because we're not going to do any checking. It's literally going to be that code. So we're just going to keep that. And I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that here. Awesome. So, but a couple things that I'm going to do, I'm going to change it because I have it set up a little bit differently. All right, so I do the same thing, initialize the app with the Firebase configuration. Again, typically I would put this in all this information in a .env file, but we won't do that now. Same thing with over here, down here, I'm initializing the auth. I'm initializing analytics. Okay, this prevents analytics from breaking if it's already been initialized. And then, of course, the database also I'm initializing. We're not going to use analytics. We'll definitely use auth and DB, but we'll leave that. That's typically the default setup for me, at least, when I get things started, pretty much my template, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click Save. And let's go back over here just to make sure we're not missing anything. Cool. We have Firebase tools already, so I'll show you how to initialize that in just a second. If you haven't installed it yet, globally, you'll need to install it. For me, I've already done that, so I should be good to go. And then this are the final steps on how to log in, to initialize it. I'll show you exactly how to initialize it and then how to deploy it. So I'm going to go ahead and continue to the console since everything is set up. Let's come back over here and let's initialize the Firebase application. So I'm going to go ahead and Firebase init. Awesome. So here, let's make this a little bit bigger so you can see. Here you have to select the different features or product that you are going to use in your app. Like I said, we are going to use Firestore, so we're going to do that. And if we do end up using hosting, then we're going to select that too. And I believe that's all that we have really set up for this to-do app. So I'm going to go ahead and click enter since I've already selected that. And then after that, you either create a new project or select an existing project, which we already created, right? So we have an existing project we're going to pick from. Go ahead and find that project. It's called To Do Firebase. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. And then everything else pretty much stays as the default. So I'm not going to mess around with any of that. Everything is set up for us. All right, so right now the hosting is being set up. Okay, so it does recognize that we have a Next.js project. So yes, we're going to use that. I'm actually a US Central, so it's actually perfect. It's in Iowa. I'm going to say no for this because we're not going to do GitHub or do builds and deploys with it for this project. And at this point, Firebase has been initialized for us. You know this because we now have a Firebase.json file, Firebase RC file, and so on. Okay, so the one thing I do want to make sure I get it done right away, because I don't like seeing it later, is I want to git ignore a Firebase folder. So later when we initialize this, there's going to be a folder called .firebase, and it's going to have thousands of files in it. I don't want to have to see that later, so I'm going to go ahead and black that out. All right, so we have our Firebase client app initialized. We are exporting the app itself because we'll need that at some point. You'll see that. We are exporting the auth, which will allow us to do authentication. We're exporting analytics, which we really won't be using, but that's okay. But more importantly, we are also exporting the database, which we definitely will be using when we're saving our to-dos and accessing it, updating it, and deleting them, right? So we're exporting it. The first thing that we're going to tackle right now is we're going to set up authentication. So let's get going. All right, so we're going to wire up Firebase so that we can actually authenticate using our app. What I've done so far is I've imported two things. I imported the auth client, which is from our client app that we exported, okay? And then I have also imported methods from the Firebase auth that they provide. We are going to sign in with email and password. When they sign up, we're going to create user with email and password. And then I'm going to add a functionality of signing out just for this for some demo purposes, okay? So as you can see, it's already set up. Our handle sign in is set up and handle sign up is set up. We just need to add in the Firebase code. So let's do that right now. Let me pull in and I'll explain exactly what is happening with the code so you understand. I have set loading, and then I'm going to go ahead and copy, since we're signing in. There it is. So with this code right over here, we are using the sign in with email and password method that Firebase provides. We pass in the auth information from our app that we initialize, and then we pass in the email and password. When successful, we set loading false, and then we receive user credentials. So actually what I'll do is, let's go ahead and console.log. Okay, user credential. Okay, cool. And then of course we could do error handling, like putting something up that shows up, hey, error, signing in and so on, but we're gonna leave that alone. So that's basically all you have to do. If you're not familiar with Firebase, you're probably like, all right, so how are you handling sessions and things like that? Firebase does all of that for you. Once a user is signed in, the whole session token or checking user that they're authenticated or not, how long they've been signed in, all of that's being handled for you. You can just grab that information whenever you want within your app, since it's been initialized. Okay, so I can show you more about that later on when we look at the authentication auth change that we're gonna check automatically. All right, so that's set up. We'll look at that here in just a second. Actually, let's test it, right? So right now we do not have any user in our app. So if I were a user that tries to log in, we're gonna use the password hello1, and I click login. It's gonna throw an error because there's currently no user available. So what we wanna do is we wanna make sure a user can actually sign up, right? So we can create an account. So I'm gonna go ahead and paste that code in here. Let me explain to you what's happening here. It's basically the same type of method to sign in with user with email and password for a user. Instead, this time we're actually creating them. So we're gonna pass in our auth client in here that we imported. We provide the email and the password, and if it is successful, it provides us with the user credentials, and then we can console.log that. Again, we don't have to do anything. The nice thing about this is once a user is signed up, Firebase actually automatically signs them in. So you don't have to do anything. We can just detect the sign in and then do stuff with that, which we will add here in a little bit. Same thing, we have error handling. Nonetheless, we're going to set loading false at the end of all of this, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click save. Now, if you remember, when I clicked on login, we receive an error because there is no user. So if I click on sign up though, there it is. Our user just got added on. If we look at the auth, it's got the email. It obviously won't show the password, but we have at least an email address that's set up. If we go to Firebase, let's check out Firebase. So if we look at our app and we go to authentication, what you'll see is that our user is now created, which is pretty neat, right? So we now have that. So let's go back to the app. All right, so what I want to do next is show you that if I click on sign up, it should throw an error because that user and passwords already exists, right? So I'm going to add a sign out button just to demonstrate the login process. It's a type button because so that we don't invoke the actual form, and we're using the sign out method provided by Firebase and feeding it the auth client, right? So let me go ahead and save that, have it pop out. We're going to sign out. Right now it doesn't show that we're signed out, but we are signed out. And then if I click on login, there it is. It works. Our user can now log in with their information. So that works. Our next step is we need to be able to detect within our app, with our ToDo app, to say, hey, if a user is signed in, let's take them to the actual app so that they can make their list of to-dos and do whatever they need to do, right? So that's our next step. Okay, so in order for us to be able to detect whether a user is logged in or not, what we're going to do is we're going to use the method provided by Firebase called onAuth state change. Whenever there's a change in the state of authentication, this function will run and grab user credential or sign a user out or whatever maybe that you want to do with it. All right, so if we go back to our layout, right now what we have is we are manually determining whether a user is authenticated or not, right? So we want something to feed this variable, then so it can actually determine whether there's an auth user or not. To do that, what we're going to do is we're going to use a useAuth hook, a hook that will continually check whether there's a user or not. And what I've done is I took the liberty of getting it started. So under the lib folder, I added a hooks folder, and then I created a useAuth hook. All right, so let's take a look at and talk a little bit about how this hook works. All right, so we actually don't need this part right here, but we're just gonna leave it anyway. So if you take a look at this auth, we pull in useState, useEffect, onAuth state changed by Firebase. And then, of course, we pull in our auth client that we have exported. We're using useEffect to determine whether a user is, and we actually don't need this dependency, to be honest with you. We can actually just initialize that. What's happening in this useEffect is when the component mounts, it runs this onAuth state change, which subscribes basically to Firebase and continues to check whether there's an authenticated user or not. All right. Just like with anything that is being subscribed, we need to make sure that we unsubscribe when the component does unmount within useEffect, so that's why that's there. But essentially, onAuth state change is that when there is a user, we can do stuff with that. I'm setting it to local user. I'm doing this because normally if we were using Redux or Context API, we can access and save that user information there. I'm doing it locally right now. We're just leaving that. We're not going to touch any of that stuff. But regardless, the most important part here is we want to make sure that we return the user. And normally, again, we would put it in a global Context API or Redux or MobX if you use MobX, but nonetheless, we are returning a user, okay? So either user or we are returning null, which is what's happening over here, okay? So that's what the use hook is used for. And the way we can use that is if we go to layout, okay, if we import useAuth from hooks, okay, I think this is gonna give us a hard time, because in order to use a hook, it needs to be in a client component. So I am going to avoid that error by turning this layout into a client. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and click save. Let's go ahead and sign out our user. And while we are here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna add useAuth to our layout. So now our layout, so as you can see, it's rendering there's currently no user because we're signed out. But if we were to log in, on. As you can see, we now have actual access to the app itself because it's now functioning the way we expect it to. Let's add in a sign out button just so we are ready to go here. So what I'm gonna do is under components, I'm gonna create another folder called sign out. I'm gonna create a file called signout.tsx. All right, so let's set up our code here. Sign out button. And the only thing we are going to return is literally a button that says sign out. And when it is on click, okay, we're going to do sign out auth. Okay, so let's make sure it's imported from the client app. So let's go over this quickly here. We have a sign out button that is using the auth client that we have provided and exported. And then we are going to use a sign out method that is provided by Firebase. And when it's clicked, it basically removes or deletes or invalidates any authenticated user that's currently in your app or using your app, right? So let's go ahead and save that. And in our page, let's add it. Thank you for correcting that. And we're gonna use the sign out button. Like that. Okay, so this should pop up here in just a second. Oh, I know what the issue is. In my sign out, I need that to be a client component because we are using an on-click handler. Let's save that. That should clean up the mess here. Okay, so the app detected that there is a user. If I were to sign out, right now it's not doing anything, but what we need to do is we need to actually redirect. So let's import the router. We're just gonna use the first line. Look at that! It just did a beautiful thing for me. So let's we do this. Love how it saves me time. Should not be here. All right, let's clean that up. So again, our sign out button, we have it so that when it is invoked, it signs out the user, and then we push the user then to the home page. So why don't we do this? Log in. The nice thing is our app now recognizes that we're authenticated. All right, but if I click on sign out, what will happen is now we're pushed back to the home page. If I click on get started, since there is no user, it won't automatically get me there. But again, let me show you another way here. So let's say we log in. If I were to go back home, right? Let's say I'm all the way home. If I go to start, it's gonna automatically get me to the home page. Let's go to localhost 3000. On another page here. If I click on getting started, since I haven't signed out yet, it should recognize that I have a user logged in and validated, and it'll get me back to the app. As you can see, it pushes me to the app itself, and we can start working on using Firestore because now we can actually work on this page. So that will be our next step. All right, so the next thing we're going to do right now is we are going to wire up our add to do component so that when we handle submit, if you remember, it was actually putting into this local state to-dos, and it renders itself here in just a second. I'll log in, but what we want to do is we want it to go to the Firebase, right, to Firestore. So let's go ahead and log in quick. Hello. Now that we're logged in, we can add a to-do. Here's a to-do right there. Here's another to-do. What we're not doing, so right now it's being saved to the to-dos local state. We're not sending it to our Firebase, right? So the first thing that we are going to do right now is we are going to, let me add that part of the code in our to-do. so that you can see how easy it is to implement. So let me go ahead and import all the things that we need. Actually, we don't need that add button for now. And then we also need use auth, which I will explain to you in just a second. A lot of these are in a different location. We're not doing actions right now either, but we are doing a DB. So let me fix this. Okay. Pull our client provider. So we have our database, which we have access to now. We have the ability to add a document, which is provided by Firebase, and also add something to a collection, right? So access the collection rather, right? So the code for this is actually really, really simple. So before we get started though, I want to explain a couple things about Firestore itself. So let's take a look at Firestore. There's the Firestore database. The way we're going to do this is, so the way it works is you can have a collection of, you can start a collection, name it something like to-dos, and you can have one collection of all to-dos for all of your users if you wanted to, and then just assign a user UID to it so that you can query it and pull all user to-dos that belong to that user. That's one way to do it. The way that we're going to do it is we're actually going to go a step further. We're actually going to create a collection of users or customers or however you want to name it, and then from there, so for example, let's do a collection of users, all right? And in that collection, we are gonna create a document based on their ID. So we're just gonna go create an ID. Let's pretend that's the user ID. And then there, so I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of that. Here we go. So now we have a collection of users. We have one user with an ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But I actually want to create a collection for that user. So a collection of to-dos specifically for that user. So now we're not having just one collection for all users that we can query. We want it specifically for the user so that we can avoid any issues with data access and things like that. So we're going to create a collection called to-dos, okay? And then we're just going to pretend this first to-do is that. So now we have a user based on their ID, and then they have their own collection of to-dos, and the first to-do is called to-do one and with some data and so on. That's just an example, so I'm gonna go ahead and delete all of this entries so we can start from the beginning. I just wanted to simply show you how we are gonna set up our database for it. And so let's go back to our app. Here it is. Okay. And in our to-do, okay, so in our handle submit add to-do, we are gonna put all of our code to save it to Firebase. So basically, save to Firebase. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of that code because we don't wanna use this local state anymore. Instead, what we want to do is we want to use this code. So, and I'll explain all of this steps to you here in just a second. Okay, so what's happening here is, well, first of all, what we need to do is we need to grab user, which is the auth user, and we're going to use our use auth hook. If you remember, it's going to either provide us with null or it's going to provide us with the user information, right? And then there's actually another way to do this, but we're going to leave it at that. And then what we're going to do is we have our normal code here that creates the to-do with the timestamp and with the whether it's completed or not. And then what we're going to do is we're going to initialize the reference to that collection, which is the database, a collection called users, and then the user UID. So we're going to use our current user's UID as an identifying ID, and then we're going to go to the collection of to-dos for that user. All right, we don't have loading state here, but we can add that. In case we want to use it. Oops. Okay, So we now have that. We also want to make sure that this function is an async function because we are going to use await when we are adding a doc. So again, let's go back. We create a reference to the database collection for that user. We set loading, and then we go ahead and initiate creating the document by using the add doc. So if you're wondering where that's from, that is imported from Firebase, that's provided. We use add doc, feed it the reference that we created initially, which is right up here, and then we give it the data that we want to save. Okay, so really we could actually get rid of this because we already created it, and we can just put object, okay, which is this object. If there's any error, we're going to console log the error. Finally, regardless, we are going to set the loading false, and then we are going to reset the input of to-do to empty it and then refocus back so we can continue adding. All right, let me though make sure that that to-do input is good to go. Looks like we're ready to go, so let's give it a shot. So let's add a to-do order grocery, if I could type. Okay, as you can see now, it is no longer saving it to the local because there's nothing being rendered. Instead, if we go to our Firestore collection, let's go to rules and come back in, we'll notice that there's now an entry of to-dos for our user with to-dos, and here's the ID of the to-do, and that is order grocery. So now that's working. Let's add a couple more. Oops, we don't want that either. Let's add one more thing. Go to the gym. And then if you see there's already one right here, go to the gym. Now we have to-dos present, right? So we have it wired up to be able to add our to-do, which is awesome. I think our next step here is we want to be able to render those to-dos, right? Because right now we don't have anything that's rendering over here. We were just doing those local stuff. So that's going to be our next step. All right, gang. So our next step is that we're going to need to be able to render our to-dos from Firestore that we've added into one of our components in our app. So actually the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of this code because we're no longer using it, and we actually want to render all of our to-dos in a different component. We want the form to serve its own purpose in its own component, so we're going to separate the concern. We're also going to get rid of this because we are currently not using the to-dos anymore. Let's see if there's any breaking. Nothing is breaking, so we're going to go ahead and save that. And then what I have done is I've already created a component file called to-do list. So let's go to that, and I'm just going to go ahead and paste the code, and then we can talk a little bit about it. So first and foremost, this is going to be a client component because we are going to use effect. Let's paste that on there. We're going to fix this because we know we want the client app. Okay, that's perfect. We're going to need use auth because we will definitely need information about the user in order, or their UID, in order to be able to save to the database. Okay, so let's go ahead and create our component. Oops. Okay, cool. All right, and we also want to make sure that we export default this thing. Beautiful. And then let's get a div going here. My auto is a little slow right now. Okay, there we go. So let's go ahead and save that for now. All right, so we have our to-do component. And let me go ahead and just grab some of this logic here. So first and foremost, we do end up using our own to-dos local state here. Okay, we do grab the authenticated user's information because we're going to need the UID here in just a little while. All right, and the next step that we need is we're going to need a use effect. So let me go ahead and implement that. Okay, for this we want this to run only when the app has loaded, but we also want to use the auth dependency because if a user is logged out, we want this thing to stop, to run again, and so it's not feeding the to-dos. And if the user is logged in, we want to make sure that it runs again to make sure that it's pulling the to-dos and it updates it and so on. Okay, so the first check that we're going to do, if there is no auth, right, we're just going to return. Check that out, it did a lot of the work for me. So let's go ahead and add that on just to make, let's just double check everything to make sure that everything is correct. First and foremost, so the way this works is we're going to create a to-do ref again, just like how we added a to-do. We create a reference to grab the collection, or at least to find the collection for that user. We're going to use the UID for the user, right, to access that, and then we're going to go to that user's to-dos collection. So that's the reference to the collection. I actually don't like how this is set up. We're going to actually call unsubscribe on this, so that when the component unmounts, we stop the subscription, right? So unsubscribe, we do not need that to do ref in there. Nice try. All right, right now, so we're going to use what's called an on snapshot. Basically what it does is that it takes in a reference of a collection, and then whenever there's any changes from that collection, it automatically updates our app. Okay, so that's how it's going to work. So the way that we're going to do this is that, so right now we have let to do. We can use to do's in here only because we're using let, which is local, so we can make that work. It works all right. And if there is a snapshot, what we'll do is we'll push all of the document from the snapshot, grab the data, the ID for the document, and add it on also, and then we set it to do. Now I'm going to add one more layer here. If snapshot is not empty, that's the only time we're going to actually run. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add that code inside here. Okay, so again, let's do this again. So if the snapshot is not empty, if the collection that's being returned or the data that's being returned is not empty, this is a key within the return value of snapshot that we can check. It's either true or false. And then what we can do is we're going to go through the snapshot itself, and then we're going to push to-dos with the data and the ID to make sure we include that. Okay. If you want to see it, we can console it. So let's go ahead and console.log to-dos before it's added, and then we can run it. So, well, actually, we can't run it yet because we actually need to add this component. Let's do this for now. To-do list. That way we can have something that renders. And then in the page layout, we're going to import to-do list component. All right. And let's go ahead and add that down here. It should, if it's done correctly here, there it is. It now pulls, it's now reading data from our database. If I add another one, pick up grocery, you'll see that it's automatically, the snapshot, this listener, it's an event listener to our database, is automatically updating and adding to our UI, to our data locally, pulling it rather, right? So you have your order grocery, pick up grocery, and go to the gym that's been added. So now the next step really is just, we just need to make sure that all of the to-do lists will render down here, right? We have the data, we just need to render it. So that's going to be our next step. All right, so with our app, now, if I were to add another one in here, we know that it is listening to the events of our database and continues to update our app when there's anything that changes within our data from Firestore. Okay, so that's working great. We just need to render this right now. Okay, so let's render in here, and I'm gonna go ahead and grab some Tailwind code here, just so it renders properly. And then over here, we are going to render our to-dos. Now, we actually don't need index. If you remember me mentioning, that's bad practice. And instead of div, let's use p for now. And if I click save, let's just make sure everything is good to go. Let's actually add some CSS on here. All right, we now have our to-do list rendering from our database. Let's get rid of these consoles because we already know it works. Let's add some more. Hello to-do, and that's working. That's pretty awesome. So our next step for this is really, we want to be able to say that it's completed. We also want to be able to edit it if you want to edit it, and we also want to be able to just simply delete it, right? So those are functionalities that are currently missing. So why don't we do that and add those functionalities? So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to extract this and create a component that will handle all of that. So I'm going to create a component called to-do item. All right, so let's go to do item.tsx. Okay, so we're gonna go to do item component. Okay, and I'm gonna go ahead and throw in some code here so that we can kind of speed it up. This to do item is gonna grab the to do. I'll just go ahead and copy all of this so we don't have to spend too much time. Let's explain them though. All right, so it's gonna grab the to-do, right? It's gonna expect a to-do object, and then let's put that in there. That's just TypeScript stuff, right? Okay, so we have that, that's awesome. And then what we're gonna do is we want to render that to-do, right? So for now, let's use P, and let's render to-do.to-do. Just to at least make sure that it's rendering. And then in our to-do list, we're gonna import to-do item. Component, and we're gonna use that over here. Let's get rid of that. Set some break. Again, we're gonna feed it the key, so to-do.id. And then it expects the to-do object, right? So we're gonna feed it the to-do object also. If we click save, as you can see, it's still rendering it, which is awesome. And if we add another one, it's still rendering it fine, which works perfectly fine. All right, no problem. All right, so the next thing we want is we want to add some functionality so that we can put a checkbox on there if it's already done, and we also want to be able to update it or delete it, right? So the first thing that we're going to do, I'm actually going to get rid of this. I'm going to put an input. In fact, I'm just going to copy this right now. I'm going to have a checkbox added on. We're going to have a method that will handle the checkbox. So handle checkbox. Okay, don't handle that. We'll take care of that in just a second. And then we're gonna use an input for the editable component here. Obviously, there's a lot of solutions to this. You can use a div and dangerously set in their HTML if you want to, so you can handle that. But this is a quicker and I think it's an easier solution. So we're gonna do this instead. And then the default value is going to be to-do. Cool. We'll add some functionalities here in just a second. You know what we can add right now is we'll disable it if to-do is complete. So that's one thing we can do. And then let's put a button, an X, and then unclick handle delete, which we'll make a method for that. Okay, and then the next thing that we're gonna do is we also want, let's do a handler on the input on blur. So that's when we'll do an update. Again, there's a lot of ways to solve this, but we'll just solve it this way. I mean, obviously there's one key up, one key down. You can do all those things where you can then use a debounce method to update the database. We're just gonna do on blur so that we can stay practical with our solutions here. Handle blur, awesome, finally realizing I'm doing all this. Thank you. So let's go ahead and save that, see what that looks like. Cool. So right now that's looking pretty decent. Let's grab some CSS here that I already created. Alright, there's that. And then I also want to add the CSS. And I'll explain the CSS to you in just a second. With this code, what we want is that if to-do is indeed complete, then what we want it to do is for it to put a line through it, right? So let's check it out and see what this looks like. Well, we won't see that yet because we haven't implemented the checkbox yet, right? So we can check it and nothing happens with any of these. Right now it's kind of, if I'm outside it's kind of ugly, but that's why we're gonna leave it for practical purposes. At least we know which one is which. But let's do handling the checkbox. So if we do click the checkbox, we want it to update the database so that it changes whatever the current status of complete is. So complete could be false, turn it into true. Complete could be true, turn it into false, and so on. So let's add that code next. All right, so to set up our handle checkbox, what we need is we're actually going to need our auth information, our user information, right? So we're gonna go cons auth equals use auth. Okay, so we're going to need that. Import use auth, because we're going to need, if you remember, the reference for our document collection in Firestore requires the UID of the user. So we definitely need to use auth. All right, so next thing is when we handle the checkbox, we actually need, it's actually an event handler. So, and we want this to be async because we are going to use await once we leverage the Firebase method. Okay, so let checked equals e to target that check. So this is going to grab the current value if it's checked or not. Whatever that is, we're going to use that to update the database. Let's create a reference. I won't type that because we've done it several times already. So but let me explain, right? So we're our doc reference. Now we're going to try and tackle our specific document in the collection. We're going to use our DB, which we haven't imported yet. In our users collection in our database, use our UID to find our user, go into that user's to-dos collection, and then find the ID of that to-do. All right, so that's gonna be the reference to find that actual to-do, and that's what we're gonna update. Okay, so let's go ahead and find our import for our methods for Firebase. I'll just import all of them for now. And the rest is actually really, really easy. So there it is. That is all that we are actually required to do, but we do need our DB, so this is going to be a lib, Firebase, and client. Okay, just to make sure. Probably should do a check. If there's no auth, we should just not do anything, right? So return. So that should do the trick. And that's a very simple method. So what we're doing is we're feeding the update doc method by Firebase the document reference for the actual document itself using the ID and the reference to the user and to-dos collection. And then we're really only updating whether it's complete or not and whatever the value of checked is. So that's how easy it is to update the database. So let's go ahead and click on hello world. As you can see, it updates all of our data. Okay, and then if I was going to uncheck that, it will also update the database, as you can see here. Right, it updated it. If I do it again, it updates it. As you can see, hello world right over here is now true. Everything else is false. Same thing with go to the gym and so on. So that's awesome. It's actually working in our database. It's updating all of the items. We could even check the database. So let's go ahead and find that in the database. To-dos, 2RL, which is the hello world. If I go there, as you can see, all right, what if we change it again? Let's go uncheck it. If we go back, Look, it's false now. If we check it again, as you can see, it changes in real time. So that's pretty awesome. That's working. So now the only thing we're really missing is to add handle delete and handle blur. So let's add that on next. All right, so handle delete is actually very easy. We're gonna just copy and paste our code here because it's pretty repetitive as far as updating is concerned. I'm gonna do, that's handle blur. And I'm also gonna do the same thing for handle blur and then handle delete. So we're gonna need that, and that's also handle blur is an event. So we wanna make sure that we grab the event object, perfect. Grab the new value, and then we have the doc reference, which is the same thing as this. We could actually set up this doc reference probably above here, somewhere up here, but that's okay. We can just leave that for now. And then of course, then what we'll do is update the new to-do value if we're gonna change it. And the same thing with, let's check that. If we are going to delete, we get the reference to the document, and then we're gonna delete that doc reference, right? So before we do that, I'd like to add a check if there is no auth, for the sake of consistency. All right, and so let's try it out. So if you remember, if it's checked, right, it disables the input, so we can't add any input. You can see there's a little bit of a gray color in there, so that's pretty cool. All right, let's just say I want to delete hello world. This is supposed to be on handle blur. This is supposed to be handle delete. Okay, so I made a mistake there. All right, let's try that one more time. If we are deleting, as you can see now, it is deleting all of our items, which is pretty cool. And then we can add some more items if we want to. Boom. And then if we would check it off, every item is working pretty good. And then if I want to update anything within it, I can say tomorrow. And if I go out of there, we can see that it's actually updating it. And if we add more, grocery again, here we go. As you can see, it has maintained the value of pickup kids tomorrow when I updated it. Okay, get rid. So all of the methods that we need to function is now working, which is pretty awesome. We have a pretty decent semi-fully functional application here. Well, I would say it's fully functional at this point. The next step that we're going to do is we're going to take this to the next level, where this is pretty much complete. The app is done. But with NextJS, there are some pretty cool functionalities that I really like, where you're hiding all of your methods and you're separating actions from the UI itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to move all of these methods into the server side. And so that's going to be our next step. So we know it's working, but now what we want to do is we just want all this code gone, not coming to the client side, and we're going to have it run on the server side, and that's going to be our next step. All right, so our next step is going to be to use server actions to handle all of our form events and move all of the functionalities, the methods onto the server side. So actually the first thing that we're going to tackle is going to be the add to do component, this form. All right, so instead of using this handle submit method, we're going to move all of that functionality on the server side. So the first thing that we're going to do is on lib, we don't need that anymore. We know we have hooks. We're going to create a folder called actions, file, to do actions.ts. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and state that we are using the server on here, and I'm just gonna start importing some code. So since it is on the server, we no longer have access to the Firebase app that is initialized on the client side, right? We can no longer import client app. That won't work. So on the server side, we actually need to initialize that every time we need to use the function. So I'm gonna import Firebase app, the initialize app method. And I'm also going to import all of the different methods that we are going to be using in adding documents, searching for collections, accessing Firestore, finding a doc, deleting a doc, and updating the doc. So I'm going to go ahead and import all of those now. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we're just going to start writing our methods that we need. So the first method that I'm going to write up is add to do, right? Okay, so for this, just like, oh, not exports. All of our functions are going to be async functions. And then this thing is going to accept form data. Okay, because it is a form, right? Which is this item right here. And then let me go ahead and just grab all of this, some of these functionalities. So, okay, so we have that. So we're going to grab the to-do that's actually the form, what's produced from the form. What we need now is we need to be able to initialize the app and use the app that's been initialized to be able to access Firebase, right? Our data. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, but I want to show you what all that entails. So we're going to need to create a function called getApp. By the way, I would love to hear other people's solution if there are other ways to do this, more efficient ways to do this. So basically what I have set up here, this is on the server side, no problem. I have this get app. I'm creating a function because we're going to reuse this for all the other methods. And so what I'm going to do is let app equals await get app, right? So it should then respond to us by resolving null or the app itself. If there is no app, then we're just going to return. Okay, and then the rest is very, very easy. It's just like all the other methods that we have been using. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy the code that I have over here. So now we should be good to go. What we can do is we can test this out, and let's go ahead and, oh, hello world's already there. So let's click add. There we go, looks like it's working. Okay, hi there, that also works. The only thing right now is we don't have this clearing itself, because we are doing server-side action, so we have to do something about that. There are a couple options, so let's see if we can figure that out right now. All right, before we move on to the next step, I do want to point out one thing that changed in the code that I was not able to explain during recording is that this add to do method, give me 1 second here, sorry about that. This add to do method takes in also the user UID. Again, this is on the server side, right? So we really can't grab that user UID, so we have to somehow pass it on. So when you are using action and form, you do pass the form data, but in order to pass additional data to the function, you can bind it to another function or to a variable. So what I did here is I created a variable called add to do with user ID, and then I bound that to the add to do add to do function, right, that we imported. And as you can see, then I added the auth UID as part of the data that goes to the server-side action. That's how you would provide additional data other than just what the form is expecting. Otherwise, if it was just all the form that you needed, the form data, then all I would have done is add to do here instead of using add to do with the user. So I hope that helps. Let's move on. All right, so if we go to our to-do add to do rather, okay, there is something that we can use. Now, typically, if we didn't need this use auth information where we can bind auth UID, we could actually turn this entire component into a server component, and then we would just have to create a component button that would handle the side where it needs to be in the client side. But in this case, because we're using use auth, it needs to be in the client side. Again, it's not a big deal. It's a small form, so it's not going to be an issue. But what we do need to do is we need to somehow handle state. We need to know like what's going on with the state of the submission of the form. So the way that we're going to handle this is we're going to need to create another component, which is an add button component or a submit button component, separate from the form so that it can observe the form submission outside of the form, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a file. Let's call it submit button.tsx. And then all we're going to do for this one is, well, let's go ahead and submit button component. Okay, and then we're going to grab the add to do submit button. We're going to put that into this component as a return item. Okay. All right, so that's how we're going to handle it. Okay, so it's a form type submit. And then what we need to do, give me 1 second here. First of all, this is going to be a client component also. because we are going to leverage use form status, which is a, let me explain this to you in a second. So there is a use form status hook that we can use. And basically what it does is it is an extension of the HTML form that allows us to access the current status of the form submission, whether it's still submitting or submission has completed, right? So now we can use that as state. So I can go ahead and add on here, disable pending. And then the other thing I can do is, if you remember in our logic before, is that we needed to reset the input and refocus. So I'm going to grab that, and in the submit section or submit button component, I'm going to use effect. Okay, and we're going to use pending as our dependency anytime pending changes. And then if for some reason, if it's no longer pending, so we know that it changed, but if it's not pending anymore, we're going to go ahead and reset the focus for the input, empty it, and then reset it. So in our add to do, what we need to do, let's go ahead and minimize this because we don't need that. We need to add submit button component. There it is. And I believe that's all we need. So let's go ahead and give it a shot, how it works. All right. To do one. There it is. So now it's working, right? So this button is able to now observe the status of this form from outside. So it's able to access the pending status of the form that's being submitted. So that's pretty awesome. So we have to do two. It now resets focus. We can cross it. We can delete. We can edit on blur. We can add to do three. Look at that. We now have functioning component using the server side and also leveraging pending from the use form status hook. So that's pretty cool. So the only thing really left for us to do is to add all the functionalities to the server side for what we were doing in our to-do items, right? Like all these functions, deleting, handling the blur, and also handling the checkbox. We need to do that on the server side. We don't need to, but we're going to do it for the sake of demonstrating the features. Let's move on. All right, so the first thing we'll tackle is we'll handle the handle delete method and move it over to the server side action method. So let's go ahead and grab the code for that so we can take a look at what we need. So on our to-do actions, let's go ahead and add the code. So if we look at delete to-do, it is expecting a user UID, and it really only needs the doc ID. We're going to get the app, just like what we did for the other one. We're going to get the database, set up the document reference for it, users, user UID, and the doc ID, find it, and then we're just going to tell Firebase to go ahead and delete it. So let's go delete to do. So on our to do item, we need to import delete to do. Okay, awesome. And remember, it is expecting the user UID and the doc ID. So that should be pretty easy actually to implement. All we need to do, okay, so we're gonna go delete to do, and it's expecting the auth UID, and it's also expecting the to do that ID. Okay, so it looks like that is working. We can test that to see if it's working. Let's go ahead and click delete. As you can see, now it's working. It's gonna go ahead and delete that. There it is. So that's working. That's awesome. So let's add a couple more. Okay, so we can do some other testing. So let's go ahead and take care of handling of the blur, right? So let's pull it up. All right, let's add our code over here. So update to do is going to require user UID. It's going to require the doc ID and also the new value, right? So again, the same thing. We're pulling the same stuff, and then we're updating to do with the new value. So that's all we need to do there. In our So we're gonna import update to do. Okay. And then over here on blur, this is an event. So update to do, again, expects 4 items. So we're gonna do auth, UID. It expects that doc ID, which is the to-do ID, and then it expects the new value. Okay, awesome. So that should work. Oh, it is giving me a hard time over here. Awesome. All right, so let's change this to 2. Let's blur. The only way to check that if it worked is if we add another one. As you can see, it is preserved, so which means it's working. Our next step is we're going to handle the checkbox. I actually added that code already, which is update status. It's the same thing. The only difference, it's the same to update to do. The only difference is that it's taking in a boolean of status to update the complete status. So in our to do item, that should be pretty quick. We are going to go ahead and import update status. So over here, it's also an event. I'm going to use update status, same thing, UID, to do that ID, and then it's going to need eTarget that checked value, because again, it is a checkbox, right? So if we click save, we should be good to go. Let's click on that. That does work, and that does work. We can delete, we can update, and looks like our app is ready to rock. All right, so now that app is up and running and now it works, what I did was I added some CSS to make it look a little bit decent. So let's take a look at it. If we go to getting started, you'll see that my sign-in looks a little bit better than before. Let's go ahead and sign in so we can look at what a to-do list looks like. So as you can see, each to-do is a little bit different now. Of course, the CSS is there. I'll show you that here in just a second. It now has the date to it. You have the to-do item that you can edit. It still works the same way. If I check it off or uncheck it, it's more than just an X now. You have a delete button now that you can get rid of it if you want to. So I can go ahead and delete. And if I don't have anything, I now have a UI that says you're all caught up. Nice work, right? So very simple stuff. Obviously, you have access to the code, so you can see for yourself. What I wanted to do is I wanted to demonstrate a little bit of Tailwind. I think you've seen that a little bit as I was going through the coding here, and that the power of Tailwind is the inline CSS that you can quickly add into your UI as you're coding at the same time. The issue with this is that it can easily get really, really busy in your code. For example, this right here actually was very, very long. If I can show you here, what I did before was, some of you Tailwind expert probably saw and you're like, oh man, that is really ugly. It was really ugly because what I had this condition that said that if to do is complete, then what I did was I had this entire thing on there. And then if it wasn't complete, then I had the other side of the code also have that code. So it was really, really long. It was messy over here, and it can get crazy, right? During development, I think it's great to do that, but at some point it does need to get cleaned up, and you'll want to transfer that into a CSS file so you can have everything ordered there, and also your code looks clean. So anyway, I just wanted to showcase that. That is why I did stuff with the UI. But really, I think we're here for a more important thing, is that we want to be able to launch this for hosting on an actual website, live website, right? So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to launch hosting with Vercel, and then after that, we're going to cover Firebase. The reason why I'm saving Firebase second is because there are some issues with hosting with Firebase with NextJS. More specifically, I ran into issues with server actions, where it's actually not functioning the way I would expect it to. So we're going to hold off on that, and I'm going to explain what the issues are, where I can go into details, and then also use this opportunity to come up with another solution in launching our app anyway by using Cloud Functions. So we'll get to that in greater detail. Let's first make sure that our app is launched on a hosting site with Vercel. So let's take care of that right now. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is we need to create a build for our application, an optimized version of our application, right? So What we're going to do here is we're going to do npm run build. And what this will do is it will create a version of our app that's ready for production, for deployment rather, right? So that's what it's doing for us. And once that's done, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure we push that to our GitHub repository. And then that's what we will use then to launch as our application with Vercel. All right, so now that we have our build completed, we're ready for deployment here. So what I've already done also, actually, in fact, let me make sure. Okay, we're all set. I have pushed my final commit over to my Git repo for this. So we're ready to set up with Vercel. So let's go to Vercel. Check out how that is all set up. What this is going to do is going to go straight to my project since I've already had other things set up for here. So as you can see right now, it lists things that are available in Vercel from my Git repo. So for you, what's going to happen is when you first sign up, you need to connect your Git repo, all right? I'm already set up, so we're good to go here. And for me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I make my app available to Vercel so that Vercel can then use the code to launch and for hosting. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so I'm only exposing the app that I want available, right? So if you see here, only selected repos are available. So I'm going to go ahead and select my ToDo app here, which is this one. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and save that. Okay, now that we're back here, what I can do now, it's now available in Vercel. I can go ahead and click on import, and I'm just going to leave that as the ToDo Firebase project name, and I'm going to click on deploy. This will take just a little bit of time, and once it's done, we'll be able to test it. All right, so it took about 60 seconds, maybe a little less than that, to actually finish deploying. And now what I can do is it actually gives you a preview of what that looks like. I can actually click on that, and it's taking me to the actual website to open up a new tab, and I can actually test the app now. As you can see, it works as expected. Everything's working, firing up from server actions right now, which is good. If I delete something, it works. Everything that that's expected to do, it's working. So let's go back to Vercel. I can go to the dashboard. The nice thing about Vercel is that anytime you push to your master an update, it will automatically update your web app, and it will work just as expected. And last but not least, in this dashboard, you will have access to the link to your app. So if I click that again, this takes me to that app itself, which is nice. And of course, it gives you the status, it gives you a branch it is, last commit that was added to the branch, and so on. So it's got all the information that you need. This is a really, really good workflow in terms of deploying your app. You obviously can add your domain, but that is all the stuff that we need to launch hosting in Vercel. So that was pretty neat. Next up, we'll talk about Firebase. All right, so if you recall when I mentioned about hosting, there is some issues currently with Firebase. Just to be aware, Firebase support for NextJS is work in progress, and so there are some issues that we're running into, more specifically for server actions. I am following that closely, and the link to that issue should be in the description, so if you want to follow that, so you're aware of what's going on with that. So what I want to do is I want to demo to you that the app is working if we do emulation through Firebase tools, and then when we do send it for hosting in Firebase, it doesn't work. It doesn't invoke the cloud the function that's supposed to be created for the server actions, right? So let's go through that right now. All right, so in order for us to test our app via the emulator, all we have to do is fire up Firebase emulators start. Now, depending on the type of solutions you use or products that you selected when we did Firebase and Net, the emulator would start all of those items. If you remember, we did hosting, and I believe we did Firestore and function. If we didn't do function, the nice thing is Firebase recognizes server-side code, so it will create functions for us automatically if it does detect that, right? And I'll show you that here in just a second. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and say start. Okay, so now that it's actually loaded, the emulator is ready to go. This is how we see it right here. Emulator is ready, as you can see. But this is also how we know that a server-side function's also been created for us. If you take a look right here, you'll notice it says SSR to do fire. That's server-side rendering, server-side code for us. So it's got a function for us that's set up to run our app. And then certainly it's got hosting ready for us too, as you can see right over here. If we actually go to the hosting site right now for the emulator, all right, we can see that hosting is being fired up, and we can see that it's actually running. So if we click on Get Started, it already recognized that I was logged in, and you can see that I have my to-dos. If I wanted to add a to-do, you can see that it's working, and that is working because it is using that server-side function that was created through the emulator, as you can see right here, function initialize, right? And then if I want to delete, it's doing the same exact thing. It's all working as expected. If we look at Firebase, we can see that it's working because if we open this up, we're currently in this user, right? We only have one user that we're playing with right now. We're going through all of the to-dos. Right now there's only one to-do. If I click that to complete, you'll see that it's updating. If I add another to-do, you'll see that the other to-do has been added. Right, here's to-do 2. And if I delete to-do 1, you'll also see that that's going to update our database and delete to-do 1. So everything is working through the emulator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate to you how to then send this to Firebase hosting and see the kind of issue that we're seeing. Let's do that right now. All right, so in a perfect world, our app is running and it should be ready to deploy to Firebase. So why don't we walk through the steps and launch it. And to do that, all we have to do is Firebase deploy. And that is it. Now, typically, in an app like this, where it's only the functions and only the hosting is what you need, you would say something like Firebase deploy only hosting and functions. You can do that. Another thing also I want to point out, which I didn't earlier, is if we were to do emulator start, typically this will run everything. Could be Firebase hosting, could be Firebase functions, could be Firestore, could be all those. But if you only needed a few of the items to run, you can say -- only hosting functions, which would also run it properly. So I just wanted to go over that with you. But for this, what we're going to do is we're just going to say Firebase deploy everything we got. And let's do it. While this thing is loading, I do want to point out, as you see here, after initializing the deployment, it does say during the preview, because we are in preview mode right now with Firebase hosting for NextJS. All right. Support is best effort and breaking changes can be expected, which was, again, I want to make sure that everyone is aware. All right, so our deployment is complete, as you can see over here. Everything should be good to go. We can check. It actually provides us the actual URL to the hosting site, right? And it tells us go to a console. So let's actually go through it through Firebase. Let's go here. This was the database that we were looking at, but what we want for this is we actually want hosting. If I go to hosting, let's make this bigger so you can see. And then under hosting, you'll see right here, we now have a default web app that's been deployed. Let's click on our app to open it up to see if it's working. As you can see, it's been deployed. It's working. Let's get started. It looks like we can log in. Go ahead. As you can see, it is working as far as we're able to pull data from Firebase, because this is the on snapshot, right? So that works perfectly fine. But the issue is when I add a to-do here, if I click on that, nothing happens. If we look at our Firebase, we will also see that it's not being added. There's only one to-do, which is the to-do 2. Again, if I do a to-do 1, nothing happens. Nothing is added. So something is not being called, right? There's an issue with whatever the server-side functions that was supposed to be created. If I go to functions, you'll notice that there is a server-side to-do function that's dedicated to our app, but it's not being invoked. Request in the last 24 hours is 0. We've already requested it twice. All right, so while we can't use server actions that Next.js provides through Firebase hosting temporarily, I do see this as a great opportunity to find a solution for it. How can we make it work? And that is where serverless functions come into play. So our next video, we're going to go through steps in creating cloud functions to solve this problem.